Vivian?
Good morning, everybody. Ready to get started. My name is Vivian Stith Williams, and I retired from the Department of Education 4 years this month. And I have been doing culturally responsive and cultural competency and cultural diversity training for quite some time. A lot with the Department of Education, but also prior to working at the Department of Education, when I worked for the Georgia Department of Labor and did some equal opportunity kinds of things there. So for today, we're going to talk about a reflective guide and try to connect it to what you're doing in the classrooms and how you can think about culturally responsive teaching in terms of your interaction with your students. So now let me get a bigger screen so I can share my PowerPoint here. Let me go down, and where is it? I don't see share. Okay, did I lose you? I don't see anybody. Where are you?
I have you, Vivian.
Okay, I don't know what happened. Hold on. Okay, there I am.
Okay.
I don't see where I can share. Hold on. I had it up, now I don't see it.
Hover at the top of your screen a little bit.
Okay.
It's not coming down.
Nope. Just a second. Let me try it this way.
Okay.
Let me get out of chat. More. Okay. Oh, I hate technology sometimes.
I think we all feel the same way.
Okay, wait a minute. I had it. Oh, hold on. Let me see, can I get out of chat? If I can get my large screen out, be better.
Okay, take your time.
Now I've lost you completely. Hold on. There we go.
Sarah Day mentioned that her share is at the bottom, and I'm on my phone this morning and my share is also at the bottom.
But sometimes seeing the whole screen. Just give me a minute.
Okay.
I can get it. I had to get the whole screen up.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Great. You got it. Thank you.
No problem. I just now let me get to my the top of my thing so I can have this on PowerPoint, and then we're good to roll. Okay. Oh, come on. No, we don't want it that way. All right. Little patience, and I guess it makes sense. Okay, we're gonna let me small screen. Okay. Today we're talking about using a reflection guide to facilitate culturally responsive teaching. What you can do to develop and implement culturally responsive action steps and strategies. And hopefully we can build on some of your prior knowledge in terms of using culturally responsive practices. I think it's important that we look at how each individual must become more aware of their attitudes and their perceptions and behaviors and feelings about the diversity, because diversity is all around us. It's in our community, it's in our schools, it's in society. And the challenge of culture change necessitates that we make a commitment to increase our understanding of our changing demographics and diversity, because diversity is, I think one of the best things that we can consider doing is to embrace diversity and to celebrate diversity, but also be aware of our own diversity as individual persons. And it's going to require deliberate and intentional exploration of who we are and what it means to be whatever your ethnicity or your cultural context is. And for me, that's what as African American. For you, it might be Native, it might be Latino, it might be white, it might be European and British. It could be a lot of different kinds of things. But for teachers and educators to be truly effective, they have to practice self-awareness, because you're trying to bridge the connection between the school, the family, and the community. And sometimes this bridging can be very challenging, and sometimes it can also be a little bit scary. And we look at it in terms of the cultural context, and what is culture and why does it matter? When you think about culture, what comes to mind? You know, culture is an integrated pattern of your learned traditions, principles, guides of behavior that you share with a group of people. And each person is a member of many cultures, and each has implications for the educational process. So think about the different kinds of cultures that you may be a member of. If you think about it in terms of culture behavior, your values, your norms, your beliefs, your customs, your communications, or the way that you do things here, you know, this is just how we do it. This is how we roll. Well, that's culture. It's art, it's music, it's food, it's literature, it's our clothing. These are all visible aspects of culture. And we tend to be very comfortable embracing some of those aspects of culture, much more than we are embracing and interacting with the persons who represent some of those different contexts of culture. If you think about it, your family has a culture, your schools have culture, ethnic groups have culture, businesses have culture, neighborhoods have culture, and it's dynamic and it changes. It just does not exist. It's always changing because it responds to things that's around us. So just know culture is fluid. So when you think about culture, what is culture? It's your work schedule, it's your language, your medical care, your religion, your child rearing methods, food, folk art, celebration, jokes, manners, clothes, and dressing. And I understand that you guys had a presentation yesterday from Christania Brown, and she talked about the name, well, your name, from what I understand. And if you think about your name and the origin of your family's name is your surname as well as your family name, that has, for a lot of people, that has a cultural context. I'm not sure what's the cultural history of Stith or Williams. I do know there's a building at William and Mary called Stith Hall. I know there's a lot of different Stiths, and some of us are related and some of us are not. And I think it's European, but beyond that, I don't have a clue. I cannot exactly go to my family tree and make some connections about where this Stith name came from because of my ancestry. But some of you can do it. You can do ancestry.com or the other stuff and find out where your cultural heritage in terms of your name, where that originates from. And that's really part of defining who you are. And some people celebrate those kinds of things. Other people are like, oh, it's not a big deal. But it can be a big deal because it helps frame who you are and what matters to you. Culture gives context, meaning, and direction. It is the filter that we use to process our experiences and events of our lives. If you think about it, it influences our values, our actions, and our expectations that we have of ourselves and the others. If you hear a plane, I'm outside on my porch. It impacts one's perceptions and expectations of others. It informs our understanding of when support is needed, and it influences how and from whom we seek support, and it influences what kind of support we need or how we ask for it. I'm sure all of you heard family members from maybe some of your students or whatever, you know, what happens in our house stays in our house, and they don't share their things that goes in their house. And they may keep their support, their family support, very close knit and not allow a lot of people in. So all of that has a cultural base or cultural foundation. So just think about that in terms of your culture mix. Take a moment and pause and think about culturally, who are you? What defines you and how you define? Does your name have a cultural context? Does your where you live or your eating habits or your celebrations, family I'm from a big family and from an agricultural family. Um, if I kind of go back and do some digging in my roots, my grandmother on my mother's side grew up with a family of 8 brothers and sisters. And then in 1940s, her father left all of his kids, I think there's 8 of them, a farm each in Southampton County. And most of them have, all of those guys have passed on, but their farmland is still around and is still being farmed, not necessarily by family members, but it's still part of our family dynamics and our family culture. And I can go to that farm where my great great grandfather lived and where my grandmother's grave is and just kind of look and get some idea of the cultural context of what was important there. Because I found it fascinating to be able to go to their graves and see who was, when someone was born and when someone passed. And I can see that the connection, and I can see the names and the importance of the family names, because some of the names were repeated from one generation to the next generation. And part of that is their cultural context. There was a concerted effort by some of those family members to pass on something from one culture, from one generation to the next. And to me, that's a lot in terms of our cultural context. If you think about the impact of culture, culture shapes our behaviors, our values, our institutions, and everyone is influenced by those norms and expectations. We all are. Organizations and individuals are defined by their culture, which reflect the beliefs and the behaviors that are informed by your race, by your ethnicity, by other factors such as sex, age, sexual orientation, and physical ability. If you think about, our schools have been mandated to educate specific demographics of students. So you think about our students with disabilities, our students from low income areas, our students with language issues, our students that are just have some rural versus urban. Schools have to educate all of our students. So that's part of the mandate for schools, but it also part of the mandate in terms of embracing those cultural dynamics that we have. So culture is central to learning. It plays a role not only in how you communicate and receive information, but also how it shapes the processes of groups and individuals. So think about it. Your brains are wired to make connections, and it's much easier for our brains to learn and store information when we have a hook to hang on to. So think about it. Your students don't come into your classroom as empty slates. They come in with a cultural background, with family experiences, with neighborhood experiences. So it's really important for us to kind of have an idea that our students bring knowledge into the classroom every day. The challenge for us as educators is to tap into that knowledge. So when you think about the levels of culture, there's the surface culture that you see, and that's the part that doesn't have a lot of emotional impact on our trust, because you see it as observable. It's our food, it's our language, it's our music, it's our art, it's our song, it's our cooking, it's the games that we play, it's the clothes that we wear, it's the stories that we tell. And then we start looking at shallow culture, and that's a little bit more emotional impact on our ability to trust. It's our nonverbal communication and our child rearing practices and our eye contact, our concepts of time, our theories of wellness and of disease, and our notion of fairness. All of those are, when you look at the tree branch, they're further along the tree. And then when you're going to look at deep culture is collective and it's unconscious, and it's our beliefs and the norms. And it is really the area that we kind of keep protected and to ourselves. It's our level of spirituality, our decision making, and our concepts of self. So we kind of keep that in the context of how we communicate. So when we think about the culture tree, the shallow culture is represented in the trunk. And it's how we can see the surface culture as observable fruit that the tree bears. And the shallow and the surface culture are not static. It's important they change and they shift over time as the groups move around and as the social groups intermarry. And then the deep culture is the root of the tree. It's what grows the individual and nourishes his mental health. and it's the bedrock of self-concept, but it's also the area I think that people tend to protect most because it is so close and it's so personal that you protect that. And it's much harder to share that, even though that for those that you are close and intimate with, you do tend to share that. Culture exists at a number of levels that we've been talking about. So it's really important that we think about the deep roots of culture, that we think about ways that we can unpack, assess, and reflect upon, and how we use that information to connect with our students, but also to understand ourselves and how we relate to others as well. So we're going to looking at the cultural diversity wheel, which is 4 dimensions, and we're just going to glance at it because I just want us to see that all these things impact how we interact with our students and how we see ourselves in the world that's around us. The core dimension is how we think and communicate, and you see that's in the center. And then the internal dimensions are out of our control, but they do have a very powerful impact on our behaviors and attitudes. Think about it as you look at it. And then the external dimensions are largely within our control, and they're impacted by our choices and by the environmental and social and cultural factors that we experience and that we engage in on a daily basis. And then the organizational dynamics, that's like your school environment or your work environment. Those are largely defined by the group or the organization in which you work. So just think about that. Those are the ones that you have the least amount of control over, but they also impact your behavior and how you connect with others and your students. So when you think about identifying individual culture, think about these dimensions here: age, personality, race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, economic status. How do these dimensions influence you, how you interact with your students, how you interact with the world, how do you see yourself? At this point, I am a senior citizen, I'm an African-American female, I'm retired. All of these, my economic status is impacted by my retirement, my age, my race. All of these factors are part of who I am. They are a dimension of my diversity. And you have the same diversity dimensions as well. It's just how you interpret those and how you reflect upon those. And they impact, because you can't hide these. These are really pieces of who you are. Excuse me. Dimensions of diversity. So here we go again: age, ethnicity, physical abilities and qualities, race, gender, sexual orientation. And these are characteristics and properties that constitute the whole person. And they're primary and secondary. Here, the primary ones are unchangeable. They're inborn differences, and they reflect your early socialization. And they have an ongoing impact upon your life. So if you look at that, think about those. And then the secondary dimensions are your educational background and your income, your military experience and your religious beliefs, your geographic location, because your perception of the world is different if you live in the southern part of the country versus living in California or in Colorado. And your work experience is also different. And then you look at the secondary dimensions for youth. There you go, your educational background, your family income, your volunteer work or club experiences, your parental status, your geographic location, your family configuration, your religious beliefs. Those kinds of components are all part of secondary dimensions. So for your students, they're a little bit different because those are built on what parents provide them, but from their own experiences and exposure. The secondary dimensions for adults are also acquired, and they can be discarded and they can be modified through your life because they are impacted by the choices and the decisions that you make. And these dimensions, they change from person to person. Each person determines which part of culture is most important to them. Everybody doesn't necessarily see their racial identity as a critical component of who they are. Being an African American is a critical component of who I am. I'm not going to walk into any room and just blend in. It just doesn't tend to happen, depending on which part of the country that I'm in. So it's really important that we understand that that those factors don't just disappear. They're who we are. They define us, or people define us by the cultural variables that they put on upon us and how we respond to those variables. So when we think about cultural response to teaching, guys, I'm rolling right along. So if you have a question or something, I'll pause after this one and see if there's any questions or any feedback. Because, you know, my time is limited and I have quite a bit of stuff I want to try to cover. But when we think about cultural responsive teaching and cultural responsive pedagogy, I want us to think about it in terms of a student-centered approach to teaching, where we really think about the unique strengths that our students bring with them. And we look at ways to identify and to nurture and promote that those characteristics in students, because it helps facilitate their achievement and a sense of well-being about their place in the world. Gay defines cultural responsive teaching as using the cultural knowledge, the prior experience, and the performance styles of diverse students to make learning more appropriate and effective for them. So you're looking at it through a strengths-based lens. We're trying to look at the strengths versus the deficits. I mean, we already know the deficits are there, okay? So that's why it's so important that we try to look at it in terms of the strengths that our students bring and build on those strengths. So cultural responsive teaching involves connecting the academics to the students' everyday lives and to their cultural backgrounds and concerns in ways that support engagement, achievement, and empowerment. So as you think about going back to the classroom and to the in-person setting this fall, I think it's really important for you to think about where your students how they have viewed the world or been exposed to different aspects of the world in this past maybe year or more, year and a half for some students, in terms of the impact of the coronavirus, the impact of the political climate, the impact of the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Those things, our students have not been under a brick hiding. Their families and their communities and their own perception of the world has been impacted. I can't tell you if it's positive, negative. That's something that an interaction with them will tell you, but it exists. So I think it's important that we understand that as we think about returning to our classroom and how we interact with our students and connect them with what's going on around them. It's important to acknowledge that cultural responsivity is a development process. It just doesn't happen overnight. It looks at our ability to learn from and relate respectfully to people of our own culture, as well as those from other cultures. Most groups are diverse within the cultures as well as outside the cultures. There's no two people in the same cultural group, within in the same family, that necessarily views the world through the same lenses. So that's why it's important to, if you look at a group of people, you really can't just assume that they fit some of the stereotypes or the perceptions that you have about a group of people, because you don't know their experiences. So you have to think about adjusting your view and your organization's views based on what you learn. So it's important that you broaden your horizon and sometimes get outside your community to get a different perspective. So when we think about cultural response in teaching, we think about how we can leverage the brain's memory system and the informational processing structure. And that's important because a lot of our students, diverse students, they come from oral cultural traditions. And that means that their primary way of knowledge transfer is oral or active. And that's pretty common that's a pretty common cultural tradition for Asian Americans, African Americans, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islanders, Latino, and all of these represent strong oral cultures. So each of these culture groups uses the brain's memory for turning the inert information into musical knowledge. That's why rhyme and rap has been so important. Art and music, another way for students to express themselves. Some of you are old enough to remember conjunction function. And you think about Sesame Street, all those shows that have used rhymes and music and action to connect learning for young kids, because they know if they connect with them, that information sticks with them, and then they can repeat it and build on it. So think about that as terms of your student processing. Culturally responsive teaching, and the brain looks at how the instruction is helping us, how you need to be aware of the bias that affects student-teacher relationship. And I'm not sure why bias has become such a hot word, but I think it's important. All of us have bias. You have it, you don't even know you have bias. You may have bias between a particular color that you prefer over another color, or a particular food. That's bias. It's not good and bad. It is what it is. But I think it's important that you think about how your bias influences your perception of the world. So when you think about the cultural tools for learning, that's why music, repetition, metaphor, recitation, physical manipulation of content, and ritual use the brain's memory systems, because you want to try to make sure that your students connect in that content. And this is particularly critical when we're talking about English language, and the poems and the things, the English stories and Shakespeare and all those things that are there. You really can tap into the repetition, physical manipulation of the content, the metaphors, and how you can activate students' memory system. But it's also an opportunity for you to bring in more diverse perspectives in terms of language, in terms of art, in terms of music. So looking at how the neuroscience connection between trust and learning is there. Excuse me. So culturally responsive teachers understand the concept of communalism that is common in communities of color. It's just important that you build that trust and relationship with your students, and to understand some of the marginalized status that represents them and their families. So when you think about culture and the brain connection, the brain is wired to enable social behavior and to adapt to new social groupings and patterns. So you're going to think about how the wiring of the brain is a co-evolution of culture in the brain. So the cultural practice adapt to new constraints, and the brain adapts to cultural practices. So the brain adapts to all these experiences and exposure that we have. And we have to make that connection for our students so they can grow from that. So we need to understand how culture, which is comprised, again, there you go, of behaviors, our values, our systems, our meanings, symbols, our meaning, our communication systems, rules, and conventions, is shaped in turn, and it shapes the brain and the individuals that in our culture. So our curved circuits are wired as a result of learning, particularly implicit learning. So just think about how what you're doing, if you connect the learning and the brain connected, then your students can take this information and grow from it. So your brain absorbs the irregularities in the cultural environment, and the brain creates a representation that influences how you interact, and then also how you shape and own your environment. It impacts the way the brain is wired and activated. So think about it, the brain is very malleable, and changed experiences over time can reshape themselves through the brain and activations. So as you learn more knowledge and apply that knowledge, your brain adapts and grows, and it kind of acts as a cultural sponge of sorts, absorbing the irregularities of the physical and social environments. So as you expose yourself to more, your brain adapts and adjusts and gives you an opportunity to integrate that information in terms of how you view the world. So that's why it's so important that we think about incorporating the cultural stuff in terms of how our students work and learn and grow is critical. So we're just going to hit this, and then I'm going to pause for a couple of moments and see if there's any feedback before we move on to the reflective question. The brain seeks to minimize the social threats, and it's going to maximize the opportunity to connect with others in the community. Think about your students. Positive relationships keep our safety threat detection system in check. Culture guides how we process information. Attention drives learning. All new information must be coupled with existing funds of knowledge in order to be learned. The brain physically grows through challenge and stretch. expanding its ability to do more complex processing and adaptations and thinking. So how does it work? So I'm gonna pause for a moment and see if there's any comments, any feedback. Any feedback before we move on? Okay, no response. I'm gonna keep it moving then.
I'm sorry, Vivian, there was a question. I had trouble getting to unmuting. There's a question from Gail. We asked students to explore culture in 10th grade. Can you recommend any specific activities?
Culture. Yeah, I mean, I think it's real, if you can have the students share their culture, what does culture mean to them? How is culture represented? What are their family practices? What are their family celebration? All that is part of the culture. So I think if you give the students an opportunity to bring some of the culture into their classroom from an individual perspective, it helps them see the similarities that we have, but also the differences. What celebrations? I mean, Juneteenth was the 19th. What does Juneteenth meant to perhaps your African American student? What does it mean to your non-African American student? We've been celebrating Pride Month. This is Black History, Black Music Month. So what does culture look like to your students? Instead of us painting it for them, have them paint it for us. So we can then say, oh, you know, I never looked at it that way, because they may see it through entirely different lenses.
So Justin makes the comment, and I'm going to share that. We talk about personal ethics and how they connect to the ethics of society. And Gail says, thank you.
Okay, personal ethics. I think it's real important to define what ethics mean to each person, because we want to make sure we're all on the same pages. I may have a certain belief system, but when I'm in the context of the classroom, that's an appropriate question to share my belief system is if it's in direct conflict with the students that are there. I think we need, if my personal ethic is to treat people with humanity and respect and dignity, yes, I can share that. And then I can frame that by acknowledging each one of my students, by knowing their names, by greeting them every day and respecting their space and what they believe in without pushing my beliefs down their throat. That's what I believe. Okay, I need to move on. I'll try to see, can I put a little bit more in at the end if we have time. When you're thinking about culturally responsive practices, we're looking at specific educational practices, instructional strategies, and team processes to increase the achievement of culturally and diverse students. Okay, and it's going to align with research and effective instructional practices. We are culturally responsive when we adjust how we teach to the needs and experiences of our students. I'm going to move ahead because I want to take the last two, to try to, because you guys have this. So I want to go to the reflection question, because I think that will get everybody on the same page. I want to take us to this cultural response, cultural proficiency in school. Most schools have a mission statement, a vision statement, or a list of values that is framed and posted conspicuously for everybody to see. So a culturally proficient school community takes the time to translate those values, those mission statements and action statements, and vision statements into behavior norms for all members of the community. So a culturally proficient administrator is asked the question, are we who we say we are? Do the data reflect our values? Do I view my students through deficit lenses? Who is included in decision making? And those are some very critical questions. So as we think about the reflection, this reflection guide, there are many frameworks and ways to think about culturally responsive teaching. To be successful, culturally responsive teaching strategies must be incorporated in every stage of the learning process, from curriculum development to assessment, okay? Cultural response in teaching is not secondary or a supplemental approach to education. Every learning opportunity in school activities should take the ancestral and contemporary cultures, beliefs, and traditions of the students into account. So what these eight culturally responsive competencies just kind of help you kind of break that down and have a conversation. So I'm going to jump right to these because I want us to take a moment to reflect on them. The first one is to reflect on your own cultural beliefs. The second one is to recognize and redress bias in the system. The third one is to draw on students' culture to shape curriculum and instruction. The fourth one is to bring real-world issues into the classroom because the real-world issues are there. I guess the challenge is for you to address them in some extent. Number 5 is to model high expectations for all students. Number 6 is to model, 6 is promote respect and for student differences. Number 7 is to collaborate with the families and the local community because that, your students come from the community. And number 7 is to communicate in linguistically and culturally responsive ways. What does that mean? We'll take that for a moment. So these are the kinds of questions I want you to think about, and we won't hit on each one of them. I'll just go to the first 2 or 3, and then we'll try to save a few minutes for some questions or responses. Cultural competency number 1, reflect on one's cultural lenses. So you might want to ask yourself, when did I become aware of my membership in various identity groups? Those that are assigned by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and gender. Okay, think about that. Number 2, how has my life experiences and membership in various identity groups, there again, those assigned by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and gender influenced my beliefs and actions? Those are the things that really think about how those relationships of your identity or connection to those groups impact how you view the world, impact what you do and how you do it, impact your ethics, since that question came up. And how does my identity differ from my students and colleagues? How does it shape my interaction with students and families and colleagues? These questions are to reflect on you as an individual because you take who you are into your classroom. None of us walk in the door and check our baggage or our identity or our cultural heritage. It's part of who we are. So it goes into that classroom with us. Have I ever used or been the victim of stereotypes of microaggression? Do I have the skills to respond to stereotypes and microaggressions if I encounter them? And what are my short and long-term goals for developing this competency? What is it that you need to do to make this happen? And these questions are not questions that you address one time and move on. I think this is part of a growth process. So I just want us to use this as we reflect on how we do what we do. Number 2, recognize and redress bias in the system. Do I understand the difference between bias at the personal level and bias at the institutional or systemic level? Do I disaggregate and analyze data by subgroups, those assigned by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, ability, sexual orientation, and gender to uncover potential disparities? To me, that's a very critical question because I want you to answer the question or to ask the question, what's the data story of your school? What's the data story of your classroom? Who are the individual students that make up your referrals for special education? Who are the students that make up your referral to the principal's office for disciplinary infractions? Who are your students that are failing? What do they look like? And why do you think they're failing? So that goes right with this question as well. How does my classroom, school, and district reinforce barriers that reinforce disparities in student outcomes? Think about it. Where are your resources, your people, your time, your money? How is it allocated? What part do I play in the status quo? Am I an enabler or a disruptor of the policies, practices, and norms that disadvantage certain students? Some of these questions are not that easy to answer because you have to do homework. You have to really spend some time reflecting on it and doing some of it, maybe even doing some research. But I wanted to share this because this is just a different framework, a different way to look at cultural response in teaching and your role. It's not being critical or accusatory. It's just another way to review this information and process this information. Number 3, you're going to draw on the students' culture and to shape curriculum and instruction. Do your assignments, assessment, and instructional resources allow your students to see themselves and see others? Do I review the assignments, assessment, and instructional resources I use for historical accuracy, for stereotypes, for cultural relevance, and multiple perspectives? I think it's really important that when you have textbooks, that the people that are on the textbook committee or at your school division or school level be diverse so that the materials that are being used in this classroom. Think about the books and think about the posters and the things that are displayed around your school. Are they diverse or representative of your student body? Or are they not? Are they just mainstream? Most people want to see themselves when they open a magazine or see something that might reflect their cultural background, particularly in their textbooks and in our history books and what we're talking about. Are we just whitewashing everything and not being inclusive of the diversity that's part of who we are? You know, how do I seek to learn about my students' existing knowledge, cultural background, interests, issues of concern, and family traditions? And do you incorporate students' background knowledge, cultures, and family traditions daily or only in particular holidays or units? Think about it. And there again, what's your level of competency to be able to address these issues? What are your short-term and long-term goals? Lots of stuff to unpack here. And I'm not trying to get us to answer it all today, but that's why you have this in our PDF format so that you can use it as a document that you can address. You're going to bring real world issues into the classroom. So I don't know we're talking about English here. So how does the content I teach help students solve problems in their lives, their communities, and in the world? That's a very good question. One that your writing assignments, your poems, and whatever you bring into your classrooms could be vehicles to help them expand on how they see the world. And do your assignments, your projects, and your assessment empower and prepare your students to solve problems in their lives, their communities, and the world? How do the assignments, your projects, and your assessment connect content areas to the knowledge in their everyday lives, including experience with racism and injustice? Do your assignments and your projects and your assessment develop your students' self-efficacy, their civic responsibility, and their motivation to challenge the status quo? And some of this you may feel like you're rocking the boat. I don't know. You have to determine that, and maybe you have to rock the boat. I think sometimes just showing up and asking a question rocks the boat, and you don't necessarily have to be a loaded question. Is that the perfect person's perception may be at that point that they're perceived negatively, even though there's no negative implication. There's some topics that are just difficult to talk about. And unfortunately, when we talk about culture, I think race tends to be one that hits people in a very uncomfortable way. And let's be really honest here. I am talking about so much more than race. Race is an aspect of it. But this cultural thing that I want us to think about is much, much bigger, much, much broader than race. Race is something that kind of tends to make people hypersensitive, but it's such a much broader context for our students and for us as educators. Model high expectations for all students. How do I communicate that I have high expectations for students of all backgrounds, even those who have historically struggled? How do I help students develop high expectations for themselves? How do I ensure no students disengage from learning? What supports and scaffolds do I provide to ensure that all students are able to meet rigorous outcome goals? What are my short-term and long-term goals for developing this competency? And what resources will I need to accomplish these goals? So these things kind of build on each other as well, too. If you have high expectations for all your students, then your students that are from historically different backgrounds who historically struggle, it's not what you present, maybe it's how you present it and adjusting to how they learn and being aware of their learning style. And you know, who's disengaging? When are they disengaging? Is it time of day? I mean, think about it. When you greet your students in the morning, you have an opportunity to have eye contact, I hope, and you can do a quick self-assessment if they're okay. And if they had a bad day, if they're bringing more, some kind of traumatic event in with their classroom, which is going to impact their attention and their focus on you or what you're teaching. Promote respect for student differences. How do I create learning environments that are safe, respectful, and inclusive for students of all identity groups? How do I help students develop empathy, respect, and understanding for people who are both similar and different from them? How do I role model proactive responses to all forms of bias? Racist speech is one. But how, and just even to acknowledge that bias exists. How do I help students recognize their responsibility to stand up against all forms of bias incidents in their everyday lives? I'm not promoting this stuff as easy or as one size fit all, or as that, oh, listen, I can do this in my sleep. This requires work, this requires reflection, it requires personal growth and a personal commitment to being uncomfortable sometimes. Collaborate with family and local community. Which families are most involved in my classroom and school? Whose voices are typically heard, valued, and acknowledged? How do I reduce participation barriers for families and community members? How do I involve families from various backgrounds in developing classrooms and school activities, practices, and policies? Do I consider myself a member of the community in which my students live? Do I regularly visit churches, local schools, or other community spaces? Just think about it. There was a time when teachers, you guys lived in the communities that your students were from. That's not the case. I mean, sometimes some of us are traveling an hour to where our students are. So our receptivity to being a part of the community is going to be impacted by our availability and our location. After being there all day and having a family, sometimes it's hard to come back to that community for whatever they may be doing, just because of the time commitment and your own family issues, or sometimes it may be fear or just being uncomfortable, or you know, it's just not something that you think is important. So I think all these variables impact how our students see us and how we see our students. And then 8, communicating linguistically and culturally responsive ways. What is this my style of communicating verbally and non-verbally? Does my style of communication differ from that of my students and their families? How do my behavior and communication expectations of students and families take into account varying cultural norms? How do I actively work to reduce communication barriers between myself and students and families? Do I offer communication in multiple languages? Do I use translators, not students, to improve communication with my families? So this is just questions to reflect on. I'm gonna jump ahead because I want to ask this and then I'm gonna stop. I want to leave you with start with this and then have a little dialogue in our last few minutes. So when you're thinking about those reflection questions, I want you to also think about your filters and some of the programs that may have impacted all of us and how we see the world. Like example, the New York Times, if that's something that you read, or ABC News, or books and magazine. Which books and which magazine? CNN, stereotypes, MSNBC, Fox News, words of mouth, your family, your Facebooks, your Twitter, friends, associate blogs, historical records, legacy. How has these things impacted you and your family? So I'm going to stop here and try to take a few moments for some questions and feedback. I know I did not cover everything that's in the slide, but that's okay because you have it, but I want to see can we have a little bit of dialogue about some of the things that I covered up to this point. Feedback, comments?
Vivian, we did have a question in the chat, and the question was, how do you get parents to buy into projects dealing with history? And this is from Clara Hill Potter. I don't know if she wants to unmute and talk about that a little more.
Yes. Year before last, before we went out on COVID, we were doing plays, and we were doing America, America. And if you know the play, one of the kids volunteered to be the slave, the kid that was from the slave, and the parent just lost his mind. It was like, my kid won't play the part of a slave. That happened a long time ago. And I'm thinking to myself, no, it really didn't, because if you look at the time frame, that wasn't that many years ago. And because he raised such a stink about it, that we were told not to do the play. And I don't know how you can get a parent to buy in.
I think, Clara, let me interrupt you right here. I think one of the most important things to do is have a conversation with the parents prior to that kind of a thing, because come on, you've had some people do some really crazy things with minority kids around slavery issues, and the parents freaked out because the kid, and maybe this kid volunteered, but some of those kids didn't volunteer, and the kids were freaked out and traumatized. So have a conversation with the parent about what you're doing and why you're doing. Ask them to be a part of it in some kind of way, and so that they can share their perspective about why they feel that way. Because some of our families were not that far removed from slavery and can tell you a family member that was a slave. So it may have had a very personal affront for him because of his own family history or family script that he may not have shared and his child may not have been aware of. Does that make sense?
Yes, I do. But the play was voted on by the parents. It wasn't one that we chose. We had a PTA meeting, and that parent was there. That's why I was really surprised. And the children chose the play. It was something they wanted to do. Yeah. And the parents didn't buy in. I just want to know, how do you get parents to buy into projects? And thank you for explaining that to me, because I never understood, because it was not even, he was the only one. I think that was the biggest thing.
May not have been aware until it kind of, that stuff, you think, oh, okay, that sounds really good. And then all of a sudden it's your kid, and then you reflect about what slavery meant. So it may have just hit him in the heart, and therefore he just overreacted because of the trauma and some of the ingrained trauma that he didn't realize he had.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think. I think we all got some stuff like that. We don't even know it's there, and it just kind of hits you like, oh. And I think that hit him. And his kids, our kids we don't always sit down with our kids and talk with them about our past and about slavery and how our families were part of that process. And we don't, because it's still painful for a lot of families.
Right. And I know when he brought it up, he assumed that I was white based off of my name. Yeah. And so when we got down to the meeting, he was like, I need to speak to her. Where is she? And I'm like, who are you looking for? And he was like, I'm looking for Clara Potter. And I said, here I am. And then he had to do a double take, because based on my name, he assumed I was white.
Yeah. And come on, all of us got our stuff. And sometimes we have to unpack it. And then all of a sudden it smacks us in the face and we have to unpack.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. I see Justin Moreland has a hand up. Is that to
Yes, ma'am. Okay. I just wanted to clarify the ethics thing I talked about. So the way I introduced it is, we talk about philosophy, we talk about reality, metaphysics, we talk about truth, epistemology, then we go into ethics. And the purpose of that is to get the students to be able to think critically about these things, like their culture and what they believe, and to share it with the class, and to also connect it to the stories that we read, so that when they read about these characters that may be doing bad things, maybe doing good things, they can compare how their beliefs differ or similar to the characters that we're reading about from, American culture or different cultures, depending on the origin of the story. So I just wanted to clarify that's what we're doing. And it kind of goes along with what you're talking about in this presentation.
Yeah, I think what's critical there too, Justin, is the age of the students. But they're again defining what we're talking about, so they all kind of be on the same page, because even though you're talking about in terms of class and in terms of what you're doing with your students, everybody still doesn't necessarily have the same definition. So that's why I like to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Yes, ma'am. It's high school. It's I taught 11th grade last year,
Okay.
and we define the terms at the beginning of the class. We give them specific definitions, from the philosophical classes that are in colleges, to make sure that they have that information so that they have a tool they can use to be able to express themselves more effectively.
And I think that ties in right what we've been talking about. So thank you. I see we got 2 raised hands. Sharon?
Yes, good morning. I was just dealing with cultural diversity. I had an issue. My daughter attended this in middle school, this particular school, and the book that they wanted her to read, it was an older book dealing with black and white, and how the language in that book that they had for their English class was, broken English, how they spoke back in the days and how we speak now. But it was a racist book to me. That's how I felt like. And I felt that it should not have been in the school, period. And because of the school district that it was coming from too, I know the background in that school district. So I had an issue with not raising Stith about it, to where she didn't have to read that book. Because I felt that book should not have even been in the school.
Did you talk to an administrator or anybody about that?
Yes, I did. So, she did not have to read the book. Because I don't think it should have been in those children should have had that book should not even been in there for them to read.
I hear you. How did they respond to you?
Well, they understood where I came from, because that just really tripped me out. I'm like, why y'all read the book like this? I understand we go back to history, but that was like in the English and literary book that they had to read, that the class was assigned to read. But I'm like, no. I said, you don't read a book like that. And to me, it was a racist book to me, and I had a real issue with it.
I think one of the challenges that is whenever they have something like that that's inappropriate is to be able to come up with something for them that's better.
Mm-hmm, right.
To do the research. So I think we have an obligation to then help them be a little bit more prepared and to be more in their perspective and do it in such a way, respectful. Otherwise, they shut down and they don't learn the lesson that they need to learn.
Right. But I don't think from there, I think they changed the book. I didn't see the book anymore. But I know that they were reading something else besides that book that they had referred them to get at first.
So obviously you made a difference.
Yeah.
But think about killing them with kindness, because otherwise, they just get resisted.
Right.
You guys, I don't know what we're supposed to do because I got 1 minute. And I really, we may have some questions, but I'm trying to, I know you guys in chat, but so Kim, we got 1 minute. Are there any other questions? It was a lot of material and there was no way I was going to be able to go over all of it. I'm so sorry.
Yes, there were a couple of comments.
Okay.
And one was to Kelly should look in the comments, and then there was one question regarding, will this course be accessible as part of certification and recertification points under the new VDOE guidelines for history teachers next year? This is from Loretta. Loretta, wondering what course you're referring to, or maybe did you mention something earlier in the presentation, Vivian, about a course?
No,
No.
it's just that I read it on VDOE website because I'm trying to get my recertification points, and I just came across that. So I was wondering, will this class be accessible for history teachers as well as new teachers and teachers who need the recertification points?
Well, the Department of Education is going to require it. I'm not sure who they're going to be working with to do it, to be honest. I mean, if I'm asked to do something, I will, but I don't know. That's above me.
Right. And that's something I don't know right now either. That might be a really good question for Christiania Brown, who was with us yesterday. And you might want to give her an email, Patricia, and I'm happy to share her email address with you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. And yes, the materials will be in the Google folder. Allison, can you make Jessica Costa, Dr. Costa, a co-host, please, so that she can be able to share her presentation. And Vivian, I want to thank you so much for another great presentation and conversation around such an important topic, being culturally relevant and sensitive in our classrooms, and the value of the reflection guide to help facilitate culturally responsive teaching. There are, we talked about this yesterday, there are some really hard conversations that have to go on in the classroom, and it helps when we have information like this to be more culturally responsive and to have those hard conversations. So
thank you. There was so much material, but I did want to kind of leave a little time to have a couple of questions, and I appreciate their feedback and their question. It really just kind of helped solidify what we're talking about. And thank you so much for this opportunity. You guys have
thank you, Vivian. And